October 24, 1944, 180 feet beneath the Taiwan Strait, the USS Tang's forward torpedo room had become a precision assembly line operating in near-total darkness, the only light coming from red battle lamps that painted everything the color of blood. Chief Torpedoman's mate William Leibold watched his crew maneuver a 3,000-pound Mark 14 torpedo through the cramped compartment, their movements practiced to the point of instinct. They had 90 seconds, maybe less, before Commander Richard O'Kane would need this weapon loaded and ready to fire. Above them, through layers of steel and seawater, a Japanese convoy steamed through the night, unaware that the submarine stalking them had already fired 23 torpedoes in less than 36 hours and was preparing to fire its 24th. What Japanese naval intelligence couldn't comprehend, what their entire doctrine of submarine warfare failed to account for, was that American submarine crews had transformed torpedo reloading from a cautious, methodical procedure. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today, taking 15 to 20 minutes into a combat-tested operation that could be completed in under 10 minutes while submerged and under attack. The mathematics of this transformation would write themselves in the cold accounting of tonnage sent to the bottom. Japanese merchant captains who survived American submarine attacks reported impossible scenarios. Submarines that fired 6 torpedoes, reloaded while still in contact with the convoy, and attacked again before escorts could establish an effective search pattern. Japanese naval intelligence officers analyzing these reports dismissed them as exaggerations born of panic, evidence that merchant sailors lacked the training to accurately observe combat conditions. The truth was far more dangerous than Japanese analysts were willing to believe. American submarine crews, through thousands of hours of repetitive training, through innovation born of necessity, through commanders willing to push doctrine beyond its written limits, had developed a capability that fundamentally altered the tactical balance of submarine warfare in the Pacific. The revolution had begun not in combat, but in the cramped training facilities at the submarine base in New London, Connecticut, where prospective submarine crews learned their trade in the years before Pearl Harbor. The standard curriculum for torpedo handling had been developed in peacetime, emphasizing safety over speed, caution over combat effectiveness. A torpedo reload in 1941 submarine school took 15 to 20 minutes under ideal conditions. The submarine level and motionless, the sea calm, the crew working methodically through each step of the procedure. This doctrine reflected the reality of submarine operations as the Navy understood them in the interwar years. Submarines would approach targets at periscope depth, fire a carefully calculated spread of torpedoes from their loaded tubes, then withdraw to reload at leisure while the target burned or sank. The entire tactical framework assumed that submarines had time, that they could disengage after firing, that the critical moment was the initial attack rather than sustained combat operations. The pre-war doctrine also reflected limitations in torpedo availability and testing budgets. With each Mark 14 torpedo costing over $10,000 in 1941 dollars, equivalent to roughly $200,000 in current purchasing power, the Navy was extraordinarily conservative about expending torpedoes in training. Submarine crews rarely fired more than a handful of live torpedoes during their entire training cycle, and almost never practiced rapid reload procedures under realistic combat conditions. The physical challenges of torpedo handling in a submarine made this conservatism seem justified. A Mark 14 torpedo stretched 20 feet 6 inches from nose to tail and weighed 3,000 pounds. The weapon had to be manhandled from storage racks in the torpedo room, positioned precisely on loading rails using chain hoists and manual muscle power, then pushed into the tube through a circular opening barely larger than the torpedo's diameter. Every movement required coordination among multiple crew members working in a space so confined that they had to choreograph their positions like dancers to avoid blocking each other. The complexity of the reload procedure involved far more than just physical movement of the weapon. After firing, the torpedo tube had to be drained of seawater, a process requiring careful manipulation of valves to transfer water into trim tanks without creating excessive noise that would reveal the submarine's position. The breech door, A massive steel plug that sealed the inner end of the tube had to be opened, exposing the tube's interior for inspection and cleaning. The fired torpedo's power cable and guidance wire, if present, had to be disconnected and cleared. Only then could the crew begin the physical work of loading the replacement torpedo. The weapon had to be perfectly aligned with the tube opening, with no tolerance for error. A torpedo loaded at even a slight angle could jam in the tube, rendering it useless and potentially trapping the weapon in a position where it couldn't be extracted without returning to port. Once the torpedo entered the tube, crew members had to connect the firing cable that would deliver the electrical impulse to launch the weapon and ensure that all interlocks were properly engaged. The breech door then had to be closed and dogged tight, the tube flooded to equalize pressure with the sea outside, and the outer door opened to allow the torpedo to be fired. Each step was safety critical. A mistake at any point could result in flooding, could jam equipment, could leave the submarine vulnerable with weapons systems offline. Japanese submarine doctrine followed similar procedures with similar timelines. The Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine force, which had achieved remarkable successes in the opening months of the war, operated under tactical assumptions that reflected their own training and experience. Japanese submarines typically approached targets cautiously, fired their initial torpedo loads, then withdrew to reload. The concept of rapid sustained attacks, of maintaining contact with a target through multiple reload cycles, simply didn't feature prominently in Japanese tactical thinking. This doctrine reflected the strategic role Japanese naval planners had assigned to submarines. Japanese submarines were primarily intended to support fleet operations, to attack enemy warships, to conduct reconnaissance and transport missions. Commerce raiding against merchant shipping, while not ignored, was secondary to these fleet support missions. Japanese submarine commanders were taught to conserve their torpedoes for high-value targets to avoid unnecessary exposure, to prioritize survival over aggressive action. The outbreak of war in December 1941 forced American submarine commanders to confront the inadequacy of pre-war doctrine almost immediately. The submarines that sortied from Pearl Harbor and Manila in the war's opening weeks carried torpedo loads that represented their entire offensive capability for patrols that might last 60 to 75 days. Under pre-war doctrine, a submarine carrying 24 torpedoes would fire carefully calculated spreads at high-value targets, conserving weapons for the entire patrol duration. Reality proved far more demanding. The submarines that encountered Japanese convoys in the war's first months found themselves facing tactical situations that pre-war training hadn't addressed. Convoys with multiple high-value targets steaming in formation, opportunities that required firing multiple spreads in rapid succession, combat conditions where taking time to carefully reload meant losing contact with targets that wouldn't present themselves again. Lieutenant Commander Frederick Warder, commanding USS Seawolf, encountered this reality on December 14, 1941, just 7 days after Pearl Harbor. Warder had located a Japanese freighter anchored off Mindanao in the Philippines, a perfect target under ideal conditions. He maneuvered Seawolf into attack position and fired 8 torpedoes, expending a third of his combat load in a single attack. 7 torpedoes missed. The 8th struck but failed to detonate due to the defective exploder that would plague American submarines for the next 2 years. The incident highlighted a brutal truth that would shape American submarine tactics throughout the war. Torpedoes were unreliable. Targets were unpredictable. Combat conditions created variables that no amount of careful calculation could eliminate. The only way to ensure success was to fire more torpedoes, to overwhelm the uncertainty with volume, to maintain contact with targets, and continue attacking until they sank. This tactical insight required a fundamental change in how submarine crews approach torpedo handling. If submarines needed to fire more weapons per patrol, they needed to reload faster. If they needed to maintain contact with targets through multiple attacks, they needed to reload while remaining in combat positions. If they needed to exploit fleeting opportunities, they needed crews trained to handle weapons with speed and precision under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The transformation began with individual submarine commanders who recognized that speed in reloading directly translated to combat effectiveness. Commander Dudley Morton, taking command of USS Wahoo in January 1943, immediately instituted aggressive reload training. Morton's tactical philosophy, developed through his first war patrols and refined with his executive officer Richard O'Kane, emphasized sustained attacks rather than single strikes. Morton drilled his torpedo crews relentlessly. He established reload time standards that seemed impossible by pre-war doctrine. 10 minutes for a single tube, with the goal of having all tubes reloaded within 20 minutes of completing an attack. He instituted competition between the forward and after torpedo room crews, posting reload times where the entire crew could see them, creating peer pressure that drove continuous improvement. The training was brutal and unforgiving. Morton would call torpedo drills at any hour, forcing crews to demonstrate reload procedures while exhausted, while off watch, while trying to eat or sleep. He insisted on realistic conditions, ordering the submarine to maintain depth and course during drills rather than surfacing or coming to a dead stop. He required crews to reload in darkness using only red battle lighting, simulating combat conditions where white light would ruin night vision. Most importantly, Morton changed the psychological approach to torpedo handling. Pre-war doctrine treated torpedoes as delicate precision instruments that required careful handling. Morton taught his crews to treat them as weapons that needed to get into tubes and out to targets as quickly as possible. This didn't mean careless handling, but it meant eliminating unnecessary caution, streamlining procedures, finding ways to shave seconds off every step. The results proved themselves in combat. On Wahoo's third war patrol in January and February 1943, Morton took his submarine into the Yellow Sea, waters where no American submarine had operated before. Over 23 days, Wahoo fired all 24 of her torpedoes, sinking multiple Japanese freighters in a series of attacks that demonstrated what aggressive reload tactics could achieve. The patrol that made Morton and O'Kane legends began on January 24, 1943, when Wahoo penetrated Wewak Harbor in New Guinea. Japanese forces used this anchorage as a staging area for operations in the Southwest Pacific, and Wahoo's presence inside the harbor itself violated every principle of cautious submarine operations. Morton surfaced inside the harbor approaches, using the submarine's superior surface speed to maneuver into attack position, then dove to periscope depth and engaged the targets he found. The engagement inside Wewak demonstrated the value of rapid reload capability. Wahoo fired 3 torpedoes at a Japanese destroyer, achieving hits that left the enemy vessel dead in the water. Before Japanese forces could react effectively, Morton had his crew reloading tubes while he maneuvered to attack a large transport. Another spread of torpedoes, another kill, then a pursuit of fleeing ships outside the harbor, maintaining contact and attacking repeatedly until Wahoo had expended all forward torpedoes. Japanese naval intelligence analyzing reports from Wewak concluded that multiple submarines had conducted a coordinated attack. The alternative, that a single submarine had fired dozens of torpedoes in rapid succession while maintaining contact with multiple targets, seemed tactically impossible by Japanese understanding of submarine capabilities. This pattern repeated itself across the Pacific as more American submarine commanders adopted aggressive reload tactics. The improvement in combat effectiveness was dramatic and measurable. Submarines that had fired perhaps 8 to 12 torpedoes on early war patrols, carefully husbanding their loads, began expending their entire capacity of 24 torpedoes, knowing that rapid reload capability allowed them to exploit every tactical opportunity. The tactical revolution required changes beyond just crew training. Submarine commanders began positioning their boats differently, maintaining closer contact with convoys rather than withdrawing after initial attacks. They developed new approach tactics that kept multiple targets within range, allowing them to shift from one attack to another as tubes were reloaded. They became more aggressive about surfacing to use superior surface speed for positioning, trading the safety of remaining submerged for the tactical advantage of maintaining contact. This aggressive approach carried significant risks. Submarines that remained in contact with targets after attacking exposed themselves to depth charge attacks from escorts. Crews reloading torpedoes while under depth charge attack faced equipment failures. injuries from being thrown against steel bulkheads, the psychological strain of working with thousands of pounds of high explosive while explosions shook the hull. The statistics from 1943 documented the impact of improved reload capability combined with corrected torpedo problems. In 1942, American submarines fired 1,442 torpedoes at Japanese targets, claiming 211 ships sunk. Post-war analysis revealed actual results were 109 ships for 418,000 tons, barely 30% of claimed tonnage. In 1943, as torpedo defects were corrected and reload procedures improved, submarines fired 3,937 torpedoes and sank 284 ships for 1,349,000 tons. The effectiveness improvement reflected both working torpedoes and the ability to fire more weapons per patrol. By 1944, American submarine crews had refined rapid reload procedures to a level that would have seemed impossible in 1941. Elite crews were completing single-tube reloads in 8 minutes. Full bow tube reloads, 6 weapons, could be accomplished in less than an hour under combat conditions. The best crews established records that became legends. USS Tang's torpedo room crews, trained by Richard O'Kane to the standards Morton had established on Oahu, could reload all 6 bow tubes in 48 minutes while maintaining depth and evading escorts. These improvements came at significant cost. Torpedo room crews worked in the most dangerous spaces in the submarine. A single shell hit or depth charge detonation in the torpedo room would almost certainly result in catastrophic secondary explosions from the stored weapons. The physical labor of handling 3,000-pound torpedoes in combat conditions resulted in injuries ranging from crushed fingers to broken limbs. The psychological strain of working at maximum speed while knowing that any mistake could kill everyone aboard left some crew members unable to continue after multiple patrols. The Japanese never fully understood what had changed in American submarine tactics. Intelligence assessments continued to treat American submarines as following conventional doctrine, approaching targets cautiously, firing initial loads, then withdrawing to reload at leisure. Japanese escort commanders developed anti-submarine tactics based on assumptions about submarine reload times that were increasingly divorced from reality. This intelligence failure had operational consequences that compounded throughout the war. Japanese convoy escort doctrine allocated resources based on the assumption that after a submarine made an initial attack, escorts would have 15 to 20 minutes before the submarine could attack again. This window was considered sufficient to drive off the attacker, to relocate the submarine and attack it with depth charges, or at minimum to maneuver the convoy out of danger. American submarines, with crews trained to reload in under 10 minutes, rendered this doctrine obsolete. Escorts responding to an initial attack would still be searching for the submarine when a second spread of torpedoes struck the convoy from a different angle. By the time Japanese escort commanders recognized they were dealing with the same submarine rather than multiple attackers, several ships might already be sinking. The tactical advantage compounded because Japanese escort vessels themselves lacked the anti-submarine equipment necessary to counter aggressive American tactics. Japanese destroyers and escort vessels had been designed primarily for fleet operations and surface combat. Their sonar equipment was inferior to American gear. Their depth charge patterns were less sophisticated. Their doctrine emphasized screening fleet units rather than hunting submarines. Commander Richard O'Kane, taking command of USS Tang in October 1943, pushed rapid reload tactics to their ultimate expression. O'Kane had learned submarine warfare under Morton on Oahu, had served as executive officer on Oahu's most successful patrols, and had absorbed Morton's philosophy of aggressive action. When O'Kane received his own command, he made torpedo room excellence his highest priority. Tang's crew underwent reload training that exceeded even Oahu's standards. O'Kane instituted a competitive system where forward and after torpedo room crews raced against each other and against the clock. He posted times prominently, created rewards for crews that beat their previous records, and most importantly, he participated in the training himself, working alongside his men to understand every detail of the reload procedure. The investment in training paid immediate dividends. On Tang's first war patrol in January and February 1944, the submarine sank 5 ships, firing 16 of her 24 torpedoes. On the second patrol, though Tang sank no ships, she rescued 22 downed aviators from the waters off Truk. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this, demonstrating that submarine crews could execute complex operations beyond their primary mission. Tang's third war patrol, conducted from June to July 1944, established records that would never be exceeded. The submarine operated in the Yellow Sea and East China Sea, the same waters where WWII had demonstrated aggressive tactics. On June 24, 1944, Tang attacked a Japanese convoy in a series of engagements that demonstrated the full potential of rapid reload capability, combined with aggressive command. The attack began at dawn when Tang made contact with a heavily laden convoy steaming north along the Chinese coast. O'Kane observed through his periscope as 4 large cargo ships, escorted by patrol craft, made their way through what Japanese commanders believed were relatively safe waters close to the Chinese mainland. The convoy's course was predictable, its speed steady, its escorts overconfident. O'Kane maneuvered Tang into attack position, calculating firing solutions for the lead ships, while his torpedo crews stood ready at their stations. At 08:03, Tang fired 6 torpedoes from her bow tubes in rapid succession, each weapon targeted at a different ship in the convoy. All 6 torpedoes ran true, striking 4 separate vessels. The torpedoes hit with devastating effect, breaking backs, flooding engine rooms, triggering secondary explosions of cargo and fuel. Before the escorts could organize a coherent response, O'Kane ordered Tang deep and changed course, positioning for a follow-up attack. Below decks, the torpedo room crews were already in motion. They had practiced this scenario hundreds of times. Clear the tubes, drain them, open the breech doors, maneuver the replacement torpedoes into position, connect the firing cables, close everything up, and report tubes ready. Chief Torpedoman's mate William Leibold supervised the forward torpedo room reload with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. Each crew member knew his role, knew the exact sequence of movements, knew where every tool and piece of equipment was located without looking. They moved through the cramped space with practiced efficiency, their movements economical and certain. The first tube was reported ready in 9 minutes, the second in 10. By the time 19 minutes had elapsed since Tang fired her initial spread, all 6 bow tubes were reloaded and ready to fire again. O'Kane, monitoring the convoy's movements through his periscope, had maintained contact throughout the reload, positioning Tang for another attack before the Japanese escorts had even begun to establish an effective search pattern. At 08:40, less than 40 minutes after her first attack, Tang fired another 6 torpedo spread. More hits, more ships taking on water, their hulls torn open by explosions, their crews abandoning ship as captains realized their vessels were doomed. In less than an hour, Tang had fired 12 torpedoes and devastated a convoy that Japanese naval planners had considered adequately protected. The engagement was far from over. O'Kane maintained contact with the remnants of the convoy, stalking the survivors as they attempted to escape toward the shelter of Chinese coastal waters. That afternoon, Tang attacked again, firing her stern tubes at a cargo ship that had survived the morning attacks. More torpedoes found their marks. By the time Tang withdrew from the area at dusk, she had sunk 4 ships totaling over 18,000 tons in a single day's action. Japanese survivors of the attack reported that they had been attacked by multiple submarines operating in a coordinated wolf pack. The alternative explanation, that a single submarine had conducted multiple attacks over 12 hours, while reloading weapons between each engagement, seemed impossible by Japanese tactical understanding. Intelligence officers reviewing the survivors' reports concluded that American submarines were operating in groups of 3 to 4 boats, coordinating their attacks through radio communication. This intelligence assessment was completely wrong, but it shaped Japanese convoy protection doctrine in ways that actually made convoys more vulnerable. Resources that might have gone to building more escort vessels and developing better anti-submarine tactics instead went to attempting to counter wolfpack tactics that American submarines rarely employed. Japanese naval planners, fighting a phantom threat that existed primarily in their own analyses, failed to address the real threat of individual submarines with highly trained crews and aggressive commanders. Tang's third patrol concluded with 10 ships sunk, over 39,000 tons of shipping sent to the bottom, and a record that would stand as the most successful single submarine patrol of the entire war. The patrol demonstrated what American submarine crews had become: precision combat teams capable of sustained offensive operations that overwhelmed enemy defenses through speed, skill, and relentless aggression. The tactical principles Tang demonstrated on her third patrol became doctrine for American submarine operations in the final 18 months of the war. Submarine commanders arriving at Pearl Harbor for their first war patrols received briefings that emphasized rapid reload capability. Training exercises before departure included timed reload drills evaluated by experienced officers. Submarines that returned from patrol with slow reload times faced additional training before being cleared for their next mission. The emphasis on reload speed created a competitive culture within the submarine force. Crews took pride in their reload times, comparing their performance against other boats, striving to set new records. This competition drove continuous improvement in techniques and procedures, as successful innovations spread rapidly through the force. The physical toll of maintaining this operational tempo was severe. Torpedo room crews worked longer hours under more demanding conditions than almost any other personnel aboard submarines. During combat operations, they might reload tubes 4 or 5 times in a single day, handling over 40,000 pounds of weapons in cramped spaces, while the submarine maneuvered violently to avoid depth charges or pursue targets. The work was brutally physical. Moving a 3,000-pound torpedo required coordinated effort from multiple crew members operating chain hoists and manual leverage. The weapons had to be precisely positioned, with tolerances measured in fractions of an inch. A torpedo loaded even slightly off-center could jam in the tube, and extracting a jammed torpedo under combat conditions was nearly impossible, leaving that tube out of action for the remainder of the patrol. Injuries were common and often serious. Crushed fingers from torpedoes shifting unexpectedly, broken bones from falls in the cramped spaces, concussions when depth charge explosions threw men against steel bulkheads, burns from hot machinery or steam leaks. The submarine force maintained the highest casualty rate of any American military branch during the war, and torpedo room crews faced disproportionate risk even within that dangerous service. Yet these crews took fierce pride in their work. They understood that every minute saved in reload time translated directly to combat effectiveness. They knew that their speed might mean the difference between sinking an enemy ship or watching it escape. They competed obsessively, not just against other submarines' crews, but against their own previous performance, always seeking to shave seconds off established records. The Japanese merchant marine paid the price for this American obsession with reload speed. By mid-1944, Japanese shipping losses had reached catastrophic levels. Tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan were being sunk faster than Japan could build replacements. Cargo ships bringing raw materials from conquered territories went to the bottom with their holds full. Food imports declined as transport ships disappeared beneath American torpedoes. Japanese naval intelligence continued to misunderstand the nature of the submarine threat they faced. Reports from convoy survivors described submarines that fired, reloaded, and attacked again within 20 minutes were dismissed as exaggerations. The alternative, that American submarine crews had achieved reload speeds that Japanese submariners couldn't match, didn't fit Japanese assumptions about American technical competence and training standards. This intelligence failure had strategic consequences. Japanese shipbuilding priorities emphasized fleet units, battleships and carriers for the decisive battle that naval doctrine anticipated. Escort vessels received lower priority. Anti-submarine warfare training remained secondary to surface combat training. Resources that might have gone to convoy protection were allocated elsewhere, based on flawed assessments of the submarine threat. By October 1944, USS Tang was preparing for her 5th war patrol, having established herself as the most successful American submarine of the war. In 4 patrols, Tang had sunk 24 ships, totaling over 93,000 tons. Commander O'Kane had pushed his crew to the absolute limits of submarine combat capability, and they had responded with performance that exceeded every standard. Tang departed Pearl Harbor on September 24, 1944, bound for waters off Formosa and the China coast. Intelligence indicated heavy Japanese shipping in the area, transports and cargo ships attempting to resupply forces in the Philippines where American invasion was imminent. O'Kane intended to intercept these convoys and destroy as many ships as possible before they could deliver their cargoes. The patrol began successfully. On October 10th and 11th, Tang engaged a convoy north of Formosa, sinking 2 cargo ships. On October 23rd, she made contact with another heavily laden convoy escorted by destroyers. The tactical situation was complex, with multiple high-value targets requiring rapid engagement before escorts could organize effective countermeasures. O'Kane maneuvered Tang into the heart of the convoy, a tactic he had employed successfully on previous patrols. The submarine surfaced among the merchant ships, using darkness and confusion to mask her approach. At close range, less than 1,000 yards, Tang began firing torpedoes with devastating accuracy. 3 tankers were hit in rapid succession, their cargoes of oil exploding in massive fireballs that lit the night sky. The engagement devolved into chaos. Escort destroyers charged toward Tang's position, forcing O'Kane to maneuver violently while continuing to engage targets. A transport attempted to ram the submarine, missing by inches as O'Kane ordered emergency speed. Tang fired her remaining bow torpedoes at a destroyer, then swung to bring her stern tubes to bear on other targets. Below decks, the torpedo room crews were performing under the most extreme conditions they had yet faced. The submarine was maneuvering at flank speed on the surface, heeling sharply through turns, her deck rolling as she dodged between burning ships and attacking escorts. Depth charges exploded in the water, their concussions shaking the hull. Enemy shells splashed nearby, some striking the submarine's superstructure with metallic clangs that echoed through the interior. The crews reloaded with mechanical precision, born of thousands of hours of training. They moved through procedures without conscious thought, their bodies knowing what to do even as their minds processed the chaos around them. Tubes were drained, breech doors opened, torpedoes loaded, cables connected, everything sealed and flooded and reported ready. The work continued despite the violence, despite the fear, despite knowing that a single shell or depth charge in the torpedo room would kill them all instantly. By dawn on October 24th, Tang had expended 22 of her 24 torpedoes. The convoy was scattered, several ships burning or sinking, survivors crowding into lifeboats. O'Kane withdrew to assess damage and plan his next move. Tang had sustained minor damage from shell fragments, but remained fully operational. The crew was exhausted but uninjured, ready to continue the fight. That night, Tang made contact with another convoy, this one carrying aircraft and reinforcements bound for Leyte, where American forces were preparing to land. The convoy represented a high-value target, ships whose loss would directly impact Japanese ability to resist the invasion. O'Kane decided to attack despite having only 2 torpedoes remaining. The approach was textbook perfect. Tang maneuvered into firing position, confirmed target solutions, and at 02:30 on October 25th, fired her 23rd torpedo. The weapon ran true, striking a transport amidships and triggering a secondary explosion that suggested the ship carried ammunition or aviation fuel. O'Kane immediately ordered his last torpedo fired at a second transport. The final torpedo left Tang's stern tube and began its run toward the target. Then, without warning, the weapon broached, breaking the surface and exposing its propeller to air. The torpedo's gyroscope, designed to maintain straight running, malfunctioned. The weapon began turning, its rudders locked in position, its motor driving it in a tight circle. O'Kane saw the disaster developing through his periscope. The torpedo that should have been racing toward the enemy transport was instead curving back toward Tang. He ordered emergency maneuvers, full rudder, flank speed, trying to turn the submarine out of the torpedo's path. The crew responded instantly, but a 300-foot submarine cannot turn on a radius comparable to a 20-foot torpedo. 20 seconds after leaving Tang's tube, the torpedo struck the submarine's stern, its 643-pound warhead detonating against the after torpedo room. The explosion ripped through the compartment, killing everyone inside instantly, flooding the space, breaking the submarine's back. Tang's stern settled to the bottom at 180 feet, while the bow remained momentarily at the surface. The 9 men on Tang's bridge, including O'Kane, were thrown into the water by the explosion. Below decks, the crew trapped in flooded compartments faced a desperate choice: remain aboard and drown, or attempt escape using the Momsen lung, a primitive breathing device that had never been successfully used in combat. 13 men from the forward torpedo room attempted escape. 5 reached the surface alive. By morning, 9 survivors remained from Tang's crew of 87. A Japanese patrol craft picked them up and transported them to prisoner-of-war camps, where they would spend the remainder of the war. Chief Torpedoman's mate William Leibold, who had supervised countless reload drills and combat reloads, survived the sinking, but would spend nearly a year in Japanese captivity before liberation. The loss of Tang and most of her crew represented a devastating blow to the submarine force, but the tactical legacy her crew had established would endure. The aggressive reload tactics O'Kane had refined, the training standards he had implemented, the competitive culture he had fostered, all became standard doctrine for American submarines in the war's final months. The strategic impact of American submarine operations, enabled by rapid reload capability and aggressive tactics, strangled Japan's ability to wage war. By early 1945, Japanese shipping losses exceeded replacement capacity by factors of 3 to 1 or higher. Tankers carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies were sunk faster than Japan could build new ones. The home islands faced potential starvation as food imports ceased. Industrial production collapsed for lack of raw materials. American submarines sank 55% of all Japanese merchant tonnage lost during the war, over 5 million tons of shipping sent to the bottom. They also sank 201 naval vessels, including the aircraft carrier Shinano, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. This campaign of destruction was made possible by many factors: improved torpedoes, excellent intelligence from code-breaking, aggressive commanders, and crews trained to reload and fire weapons faster than any opponent thought possible. Japanese naval intelligence never fully understood how American submarines had achieved such devastating effectiveness. After the war, interrogations of Japanese naval officers revealed that they had continued to assume American submarines followed conventional doctrine, approaching targets cautiously, firing initial loads, then withdrawing to reload at leisure. The concept that American crews could reload all tubes in under an hour while maintaining contact with targets remained outside Japanese tactical understanding even after defeat. Richard O'Kane survived Japanese captivity and returned to the United States after Japan's surrender. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions commanding Tang during her final patrol, becoming the only submarine commanding officer to receive the nation's highest decoration and survive the war. His tactical innovations, particularly his emphasis on rapid reload capability, influenced submarine doctrine for decades. The story of American submarine torpedo room crews during World War II demonstrates a fundamental truth about military effectiveness. Technical superiority matters, intelligence and doctrine matter, but ultimately, combat success depends on ordinary sailors performing extraordinary feats under impossible conditions, on crews trained to precision through thousands of repetitions, on men who take pride in excellence and compete to exceed every standard. The torpedo room crews who reloaded weapons in darkness while depth charges shook their boats, who handled thousands of pounds of high explosive with speed and precision, who made possible the aggressive tactics that devastated Japanese shipping, deserve recognition as the unsung heroes whose skill and dedication changed the course of the Pacific War. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.